Welcome. It's so nice to be addressing an audience of Germanists. They're amazingly punctual, all ready for anything, which is brilliant. My name is Godela Weiss-Sussex. I'm Professor of German Literature here at the ILCS. I am going to sort of guide you through this afternoon. So this is the Sylvia Naish lecture. Sylvia Naish was a linguist, a translator, who was very closely connected with the Institute when the Institute was still the Institute of Germanic Studies. So she left us a donation, and with that donation we've been able for many years now to support fellowships. So that's funded scholarships. If you're ever interested, keep a lookout for them. And also the Sylvia Naish lecture. And I always think of the Sylvia Naish lecture as a celebration of all your work, all the postgraduates' work, because we get a lot of applications in, and then we see all the stuff that's going on, and we'd like to hear you all. But it's just a wonderful moment of seeing, how much is going on in the field. So today we're welcoming Anna Weber for our 2025 Sylvia Naish lecture, and Anna is doing a joint PhD between KCL and Stuttgart. I wish there were more of these programs. It's just a fantastic opportunity. So she's doing that. She actually studied English at her undergraduate degree, at her MST, and then only sort of during her MST worked her way over into German, and is now doing a PhD project on German Jewish women's autobiographical writing. And we'll hear about just a snippet out of her PhD research, and we'll hear all about Gabriele Tergit. So welcome, and we listen to you.
Thank you so much. It really is a great honor to be here today, and I'm very excited to speak about Gabriele Tergit's 1951 exile novel Effingers today. Let me just switch to my presentation. The German Jewish writer Gabriele Tergit has emerged as one of the major rediscoveries within German literature during the last 10 years. Having built an impressive career as one of the few female court reporters in the Weimar Republic, Tergit had fled Berlin in early 1933. After 5 years in exile in Czechoslovakia and Mandate Palestine, she found permanent exile in London in 1938. Between the early 1930s and 1950s, Tergit was working on her novel Effingers, chronicling the lives of 4 generations of a German Jewish family. Effingers, like the rest of Tergit's novels, was never translated into English during her lifetime and was met with an all but muted response in the German language sphere. Tergit's oeuvre was not properly rediscovered until the republication of her first novel Käsebier erobert den Kurfürstendamm, Käsebier takes Berlin, in 2016. Since then, her works have both found a new readership and generated unprecedented academic interest in the German-speaking world. She remains much less well-known to English-speaking audiences. This is despite her having spent 44 years, exactly the second half of her life, here in London. Given the upcoming first publication of Effingers in English this November, my aim in this lecture is to introduce Tergit firstly as an important female voice that helps redress the still prevalent predominance of male authors in German exile literature, and secondly as a fascinating transnational writer whose work bridges German and British culture. I will first provide some background information on Tergit's life and career, drawing upon Nicole Henneberg's biography that was published just last year, and upon my own research on Tergit's memoir that I have carried out in the German National Literature Archive at Marbach, close to Stuttgart, where Tergit's papers are held. Given that literary scholarship has largely focused on Tergit's relationship to her home city of Berlin, I then turn to Tergit's unpublished Buch über England, or Book About England, in the next section. Written while Tergit was just finishing Effingers, the Buch über England offers fascinating cultural commentary based on her early impressions of the UK. Beyond that, however, I'd like to introduce the Buch über England as a complementary text to Effingers. Both texts, in my view, have a keen political impetus, having been intended to serve interlinking functions for post-war German readers. While the Buch über England sought to re-educate them in view of building a more democratic and inclusive society, Effingers is a haunting memorialisation of a lost German Jewish past. In the third section, I thus turn to Effingers, hoping to make a case for why it should urgently be reinscribed into literary history. I will briefly sketch the text's difficult production and publication history, as well as its frustrating reception during Tergit's lifetime. Without giving too much away, I will also present short readings of key passages in the book, to underline just why it constitutes such an essential text. I will conclude with a coda based on an interview that I was able to conduct with the translator Sophie de Wernoy for this lecture, hoping to whet your appetite for the book's upcoming publication in English. Tergit was born Elise Hirschmann in Berlin in 1894, the daughter of a pioneer industrialist. Her father, Siegfried Hirschmann, was the founder of Deutsche Kabelwerke, which soon became an international business. Elise grew up in a very wealthy family. Unusually, however, they lived in the working-class district of Friedrichshain, where her father's factory was located. Moving to the posh Tiergarten area with her parents at the age of 14, Tergit's upbringing gave her an awareness of the grave social inequalities in turn-of-the-century Berlin. At 16, Tergit was allowed to attend the newly founded Soziale Frauenschule, which was run by well-known women's rights activists such as Alice Salomon. Having managed to place an article about her experiences in social work in the high-profile newspaper Berliner Tageblatt in 1915, she resolved to acquire a higher education. Having passed her Abitur, or A-levels, in 1918, Tergit studied history in Munich, Heidelberg, and Berlin, part of a tiny minority of female students. She completed a doctorate in 1925. During the following 7 years, Tergit built her career as a reporter, mostly writing for the Berliner Tageblatt. In 1928, she married the architect Heinz Reifenberg, and in the same year their son was born. Reifenberg was from a Russian Jewish industrialist family, but they had lost most of their wealth in the 1917 revolution. Due to the pressures of inflation and rising economic uncertainty, Reifenberg increasingly struggled professionally, and Tergit became the family's main breadwinner. She published her first novel, the new objectivist satire Käsebier über den Kurfürstendamm, to great acclaim in 1931. Together with Hans Fallada's Kleiner Mann was nun and Erich Kästner's Fabian, both of which you might know, Käsebier was awarded a prize as Book of the Year 1932. Around the same time, Tergit's portrait was included in a celebrity who's who of arts and culture, chosen by reader vote in the Berliner Tageblatt. The other VIPs pictured were Gottfried Benn, Henri Bergson, Oswald Spengler, Erich Mendelssohn, Erich Maria Remarque, and Jakob Wassermann, lots of who you might have heard of. This underlines Tergit's fame and popularity at the peak of her career, and even more so, it suggests a reason as to why she became the only forgotten author from this list. She was the only woman. Having reported about a trial against Hitler and Goebbels at a Berlin criminal court where they had been charged with a press offense, Tergit was high on the Nazis' list of enemies. In the night before the last pseudo-democratic election in Germany on 5 March 1933, SA came to arrest Tergit at her flat. They were not able to break through the door, which had recently been fortified against such attacks. Early the next day, Tergit took a train to Czechoslovakia without much luggage so as not to attract any attention. After 6 months, she rejoined her husband and son, emigrating to Mandate Palestine with them. Living in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, Heinz Reifenberg was able to work as an architect again. Tergit, however, struggled to find any outlets for her journalism. The family also battled persistent health issues and found it very hard to learn Hebrew. In addition, Tergit, as an ardent anti-Zionist, did not easily integrate into the local society. Although she had entered Mandate Palestine illegally, Tergit managed to secure a passport issued by Great Britain on the basis of the 1925 Palestinian citizenship order, obtaining permission to be in the UK for a period of 12 months. Despite this precarious legal residency status, the family relocated to London in June 1938. Tergit's retrospective reasoning is primarily emotional. London war für uns ein unbeschreibliches Glück. Endlich konnten wir wieder in ein Museum gehen, in einer europäischen Großstadt zu leben, nun in die Oper zu gehen, ein Ballett zu sehen. Das war schon ein Vergnügen, das wir fast nicht mehr kannten. I will always read Tergit's original quotes, but I have included translation for you in English. Initially, Tergit and her family moved in emigrant circles, living in furnished rooms in the Belsize Park area in northwest London. They were able to buy a house in southeast Putney shortly after the Blitz, when housing prices in London were low, but it was immediately requisitioned to store furniture belonging to bombed-out families. Tergit and her husband were only able to move there in 1946. While Heinz Reifenberg re-established himself as an architect and their son enjoyed striking success at Cambridge, Tergit herself blamed her lack of language skills for the fact that she was unable to resume the career she had had in Berlin. She published only sporadically, for example in the Association for Jewish Refugees journal. However, she continued to write fiction in German. Not only did she complete her magnum opus Effingers in London, but she also wrote a second family epic, which was posthumously published as So war's eben in 2021. Additionally, she achieved a certain amount of recognition with non-fiction books, especially the 1958 work Kaiserkron und Päonienrot on the cultural history of flowers. Based on years of research in the library of the Natural History Museum, the slim volume became Tergit's biggest international success during her lifetime, being translated into English, Italian, Bulgarian, Hungarian, and Swedish. Next to her writing, Tergit led an active social life in London, though it was largely centered around the German Jewish exile community. She was a member of the Club 43, a social club for emigrants founded during the Blitz that hosted weekly talks and other events. Later, she became a key literary networker thanks to her many years of volunteering for the London-based Penn Center for German-speaking authors abroad, first as treasurer, then as secretary. After both her son and her husband had passed away in the mid-1960s already, the latter role became Tergit's main occupation until her own death in 1982 at the age of 88. Her former colleague Hans Saal called her the first lady of the emigration in a letter from 1968. This title appears justified in view of her correspondences with many exiled authors in the UK and elsewhere, many of whom are much better remembered today, such as Hage Adler, Hilde Domin, Erich Kästner, Mascha Kaleko, Arthur Köstler, Nelly Sachs, Hilde Spiel, Armin T. Wegner, and Arnold Zweig. Despite her evident networking skills, she found it hard to re-establish contacts in post-war Germany. Tergit traveled to Berlin frequently from 1948, yet was met with coldness by many in the newly reforming cultural and literary circles. Even into the 1970s, the early days of exile studies in Germany, Tergit was still treated with disrespect. More than once, she gave letters and testimonials about her experience to non-Jewish German researchers and journalists, only to see that material used without her being properly credited as the author. At the same time, Tergit was fighting for financial compensation for some of her family's losses resulting from the persecution, which dragged on for years. It is therefore not surprising that she kept an emotional distance from post-war Germany. She did not like the term exile literature, but equally did not identify with either West German or GDR post-war writing. As Till Greite has summarized, sie beschrieb sich als einer dritten Literatur verpflichtet. Einer, die sich im Niemandsland abseits der sich abschottenden Literaturen in Ost und West eingerichtet hatte. In view of this, I now turn to Tergit's literary production in London, which became her locus for producing such a third literature. I focus on the first decade from 1938 to 1948, when Tergit was working both on the Buch über England and Effingers. In the Buch über England, Tergit ostensibly attempts to convey to a post-war German audience the central cultural and political characteristics of the UK. As was common in colloquial usage in German, England metonymically refers to the UK as a whole here, although many of Tergit's observations do in fact rest upon her personal experiences in the south of England, specifically in London. As an indirect juxtaposition of the UK and Germany, the Buch über England also reveals Tergit's didactic impulse to contribute to democratic re-education in occupied Germany. While the Buch über England can also be read as a rare German language contribution to the British tradition of national character writing, Tergit's text doubles as an implicit investigation of the reasons for the rise of fascism in Germany. Her guiding question throughout the book appears to be why there was no mass fascist movement in England or the UK. The Buch über England can thus best be described as an experiment in genre, blending journalistic and essayistic modes of writing, cultural historical analyses, and life writing elements. It attempts to cover a broad variety of topics, with chapters on climate and landscape, housing, London, food, fashion, and social life. In chapters entitled Freedom and On the Workings of the English Parliamentary Government, Tergit offers an introduction to British political culture. However, there is also an intriguing autobiographical dimension to the Buch über England, underlined by the fact that Tergit's drafts include a personal chapter called First Impressions. Lastly, there are many thematic overlaps with Effingers. In the following, I offer brief readings of some passages based on my research at Marbach, where the Buch über England is held. I specifically focus on Tergit's portrayal of the intersection of Englishness, class, and gender, critically evaluating this in view of her own experience of marginalization as a refugee. Most draft versions of the Buch über England begin as follows. England ist nie ein Reiseland gewesen, in das man zur Erholung oder zum Vergnügen fuhr. Eine Reise nach England war immer eine geistige. 100 Jahre fuhr man nach England, um zu lernen, wie man Kaufmann oder Fabrikant wird. This claim neatly summarizes both the attitude towards the UK that was prevalent in Tergit's family while she was growing up, and how she portrays the country in Effingers. Decades before Tergit and several members of her family fled to the UK, her father had frequently traveled here in view of his business connections in London. Siegfried Hirschman had been friends with an industrialist called Hugo Hirsch, later anglicized as Hugo Hurst, who was later given a peerage by Lloyd George. Hirsch, who was from the same region in Bavaria as Tergit's parents, may have served as an inspiration for Tergit's fictional character Benno Effinger. Effinger also migrates to England at an early age, founds a tool factory here, and later becomes a lord. The First World War, in which Benno loses his 2 sons, ultimately leads to a split with the German line of the Effinger family. In the novel, the main character Paul Effinger's visit to his older brother in turn-of-the-century London are described in plenty of detail. The passages reflect Tergit's enthusiasm for British liberalism and entrepreneurial spirit, which also characterized the Buch über England. In her introduction to the book, Tergit portrays the UK as a preferred place of asylum for the politically persecuted, making an implicit connection to the time of writing. Oder man kam nach England als Flüchtling. Protestant von Holland oder von Frankreich, Aristokrat von Frankreich oder von Russland, Gegner Napoleons III. Von Frankreich und Gegner der Reaktion von Deutschland. Montesquieu kam nach England und fand hier den Geist der Gesetze, der 50 Jahre später der Französischen Revolution ihre geistige Grundlage gab. Engels kam nach England und fand hier die Lage der arbeitenden Klassen, die 50 Jahre später der Russischen Revolution ihre geistige Grundlage gab. Referring to Montesquieu and Engels, Tergit suggests that persecuted intellectuals in the past have managed to forge radically new and highly influential ideas while in exile in the UK. She may have been voicing a hope for her own generation in this passage. As I will show through 2 close readings now, however, Tergit's cultural analyses of the UK greatly idealise mid-century British society. This is most evident in Tergit's comments on class in the chapter First Impressions. In a subsection entitled No Class Struggle, Tergit describes a scene outside a London hotel thus. Aus dem Hotel kam ein Herr im Frack mit einem Wollschal und eine Dame mit einem Gesellschaftskleid. In Deutschland hatte man schon ein Vierteljahrhundert früher, 1913, nicht mehr gewagt, in einem Abendkleid über die Straße zu gehen oder in öffentlichen Gefährten zu fahren. In London und 1937 taten die Leute das ohne weiteres. In der Nacht kamen Damen mit Brillanttiaras aus der Oper und die Marktleute, ein Dutzend Körbe mit Gemüse oder Salat auf dem Kopf balancierend, kreuzten ihren Weg. Kein Wort und kein Blick machte die Situation peinlich. Keiner ballte die Faust oder streckte die Hand zum Himmel als Gruß. Tergit condenses the relationship between the British upper class and the working class into an encounter between women in evening dress and green clothes. The latter refrain from political statements such as the communist red front salute with the clenched fist or the fascist Roman salute. In Tergit's depiction, this allows for a harmonious crossing of parts as human beings rather than as representatives of mutually antagonistic classes. Berlin clearly emerges as Tergit's point of comparison here. However, Tergit's portrayal glosses over the fact that in the UK too, The social conflicts exacerbated by the Great Depression had led to significant public unrest. For example, supporters of the British Union of Fascists, founded by Oswald Mosley in 1932, had clashed with counter-demonstrators in the so-called Battle of Cable Street in East London in October 1936. Against this background, Tergit's scene of social harmony in London in 1937 seems too idyllic. Similarly, she appears to significantly idealize the state of gender relations in the UK. Es ist ein Männerland, ein vernünftiges, sprühend geistvolles Männerland. Die Männer leben für sich, zuerst in der Schule, wo die obere Schicht auch wohnt, dann in der Universität, wo sie in ihren Colleges wohnen, dann in ihren Clubs. Die Frauen richten sich darauf ein. Die Frauen können alles, was die Männer können. Sie sind Universitätsprofessoren, Richter und Minister. Es gibt kein Vorurteil gegen sie. Interestingly, this contradictory passage begins with an echo of Tergit's first ever article from 1915. Its opening sentence read, "Our time is men's time," referring to the First World War. Although Tergit was working on the Buch über England during the Second World War, the labeling of the UK as a man's country does not seem to be specifically linked to its wartime glory. In Tergit's somewhat paradoxical description, British women are in no way discriminated against, despite living in a man's country. This is despite the fact that women were, of course, marginalized in the professions that Tergit lists. However, Tergit's enthusiastic appraisal of class and gender relations in the Buch über England become less puzzling when read as a deliberate effort to re-educate post-war Germans by portraying a decidedly democratic and inclusive British way of life. As Tergit's correspondence with Allied authorities shows, this was her intention for the text. Lacking the necessary connections, Tergit was not able to place the manuscript anywhere. However, she eventually repurposed individual passages as articles, as well as incorporating some in her later memoir. Tergit's personal experiences of exclusion in the UK are less evident in the Buch über England than in statements she made in a private interview from 1979. For instance, she commented unenthusiastically on her move to Putney, which had meant a deliberate local separation from German Jewish emigrant circles. "I can't judge whether it was the right decision," she said. When asked if she had considered England her second home, a country, a society in which she wanted to integrate, she replied, "Nein, man gehörte nicht dazu. Ich bin mir immer darüber im Klaren gewesen, dass man kein Engländer werden kann. Man kann ein Amerikaner werden, das ist selbstverständlich. Aber man wird weder ein Franzose noch ein Engländer. Dazu braucht es für Immigranten eben doch Generationen." Tergit's juxtaposition of American identity as a status that may be acquired with English and French identity as accessible only by birth reveals her conception of Englishness as exclusive after all. As a refugee, Tergit had first-hand experience of the mechanism of marginalization legitimized by the concept of Englishness. I've included a quote here from a volume called Writing Englishness that provides some context on the status of immigrants in UK society at the time. In this period, there was considerable interaction between the discourses of exclusivity, which promoted the idea that the essential English qualities remained the property of the civilized upper middle classes, and those which sought to incorporate the ordinary man as the backbone of England. Both projections tended to be very of the masses, of women other than the English gentlewoman, and of immigrants from anywhere. I now turn to Effingers as a complementary text, attesting to a different aspect of Tergit's keen political sensibilities. Covering the years from 1878 to 1948, Effingers traces 4 generations of strictly speaking not just one, but 2 German Jewish families. Linked by marriage, Tergit based the southern German Effingers and the Oppner Goldschmidts in Berlin on her own and her husband's families, also weaving in autobiographical experiences through the characters Lotte and Marianne Effinger. Intriguingly, this is not just supported by parallels between these characters' lives and Tergit's own, but by the fact that I have found manuscript pages from the novel among Tergit's drafts for her later memoir, for which they presumably served as something like an aide-memoir. Exemplifying German Jewish experiences in Imperial Germany during the First World War, in the Weimar Republic, and eventually in the Third Reich and in exile, Tergit's approach to the project was decidedly documentary. As she told a former colleague in 1949, her wish was for every German Jew to feel, Ja, so waren wir. So haben wir gelebt zwischen 1878 und 1938. Und dass sie es ihren Kindern in die Hände legen mit den Worten, damit ihr wisst, wie es war. In accordance with this, Tergit's style in Effingers is noticeably factual, clearly indebted to both journalistic and new objectivist modes of writing, also attesting to Tergit's earlier career as a reporter, as well as her success with Käsbier over in Kurfürstendamm. Moreover, Effingers is rich in historical detail, not only as regards fashion and interiors, but also with respect to the characters' speech patterns. Featuring more than 80 characters and frequently switching between them, the novel's multi-perspectivity enables it to reflect a panorama of exemplary experiences and opinions. As the novel progresses, its chapters become shorter and the switches between the characters' perspectives more frequent. Effingers thus creates a sense of acceleration and in some ways increasing confusion and conflict that is in tune with the rapid social changes that German society underwent after the First World War. Tergit's highly visual mode of writing and her modernist montage technique, which even incorporates quotes from real historical texts, appear inspired by the rising prominence of cinema during the period of time that the book covers. When Tergit traveled to Berlin for the first time after the war in 1948, she carried the last copy of the manuscript that she possessed. 2 had been lost during the war and another 2 during the search for a publisher. In view of her first impressions of post-war Berlin, Tergit decided to add what constitutes perhaps the most effectively shattering chapter. Set on a Saturday in May 1948, the 3-page epilogue revisits the key settings of the novel, mapping out a geography of near-total destruction. The short opening paragraph charts the following deceptively peaceful scenery. Draußen im Grunewald, wo Erwin und Lotte zuletzt gewohnt hatten, blühten die roten Kastanien, fuhren die amerikanischen und englischen Autos, spielten glückliche neue Kinder. Erwin und Lotte, by the way, have often been read as alter egos of Tergit and her husband. Seemingly painting a spring tableau of renewal and in many ways rebirth, Tergit's use of the phrase neue Kinder, new children, instead of the far more idiomatic junge Kinder or young children, drives home the fact that Effingers by no means just mimics the social realist novel of the 19th century, but experiments with stylistic innovation. A much darker version of Theodor Fontanes and Thomas Mann's subtle irony, Tergit's diction here is unsettling, reminding the reader that the children playing in the Grunewald in 1948 have not succeeded, but in fact replaced the children who used to play there just years earlier. The phrase makes clear that the latter have either fled or have been deported and murdered. The epilogue thus already undermines any sense of a chastised, uncomplicated new beginning for post-war Germany. Moving on to a description of the Tiergarten district, which provided the background for key scenes in Effingers, Tergit makes this message clearer still. Nicht mehr grüßten sich die Leute am Sonntagvormittag, denn es gab kaum mehr Leute in diesem ganzen Viertel. Die meisten Leute waren zerstreut in alle Richtungen der Windrose oder sie lagen unter den Trümmern und soweit sie Juden waren, waren sie angesiedelt worden für die Ewigkeit. The only direct reference in the epilogue to Jewish Berliners mass flights or murder in the Holocaust, the disturbingly matter-of-fact passage is striking in how it also points to the deaths of many non-Jewish Berliners during the city's bombing. Tergit appears to have incorporated this explicit statement out of a documentary impulse to memorialize for future generations, wie es war, how it was. Given that a passage in Tergit's memoir resembles this quote from Effingers very closely, it's moreover clear that she was drawing upon her first-hand impressions of revisiting the sites of her own life in Berlin. Ich sprach Menschen von früher, nicht viele. Die meisten, die ich gekannt hatte, waren in Amerika, in England, Palästina oder waren vorzeitig angesiedelt worden für die Ewigkeit. Understandably, given this direct autobiographical background, Tergit found work on the epilogue very difficult, as her correspondence shows. Writing to her editor, she asked for advice on whether to include it at all, worrying that it didn't do justice to the scale of events, as she called it. Fortunately, the epilogue remained part of the text and arguably does do justice to the scale of events, precisely through its matter-of-fact style and its brevity. According to Tergit scholar Juliane Zucker, Tergit had probably begun writing Effingers in the summer of 1932 already. At the time, the publisher Ernst Rowohlt explicitly recommended that she write a recognizably Jewish novel, since there was a large Jewish reading public in Germany. In a letter, Tergit claims that she wrote Effingers in 35 different rooms during her continued migrations in the following years, but large parts of the book appear to have been completed by 1938. Tergit mailed the manuscript to a competition organized by the American Guild for German Cultural Freedom, also in 1938, but was unsuccessful due to the book's length of more than 800 pages. After she had finally received the manuscript back just before the outbreak of the war, it was allegedly almost accepted by the British publisher John Lane. Yet again, however, the book's length prevented its translation and thus also its publication. In the early years of her exile in London, Tergit then adapted the manuscript to include some of the historical developments of the years 1938 to 1948. Despite the considerable historical importance of her text in view of its documentary and testimonial properties, Tergit's search for a publisher proved frustrating. Ernst Rowohlt instead opted for a Polish Jewish family novel by Sophie Kramstik and did not want to publish a second book with a similar theme. Hermann Ullstein, in turn, rejected Effingers on the grounds that, in his view, in post-war German literature, Jews would have to be represented as, I quote, edle Menschen, noble people only, and that Effingers failed in this regard. Having finally placed the book with Hammerich and Lesser, the latter debated shortly before the book's publication whether it should be released without mentioning Tergit as the author on the cover, arguing that her name had become too unknown in Germany. Tergit protested, stressing that while her name might no longer be familiar to the general public, it would still be recognized by those with literary interest. According to Tergit, only 30 booksellers ordered the book at all, and only around 2,000 copies were sold of the first two editions, the 1951 original and the shortened 1964 re-edition that Tergit disliked. There were no new editions until 1978 and then 2019. Tergit had also tried, unsuccessfully, to place Effingers with publishers in the UK, US, Israel, Switzerland, Sweden, Holland, South Africa, and Argentina. In a letter, she reasoned that she had produced a book that was only of appeal to a minority, a problem that did not just pertain to the German market, but to the entire Western world. Frustratingly, Tergit even found that she was not met with a positive response from Jewish readers. Her brother-in-law, Adolf Reifenberg, an Israeli academic, analyzed the problem thus. Die deutschen Juden sind geschlagen, zerschlagen, sie sind kein Faktor mehr und die Welt will sich an die Morde nicht mehr erinnern. Denn man braucht die Deutschen ihre soldatischen Tugenden. Nun schreibst du richtig, dass es auch deutsche Juden gibt und dass das Buch eigentlich für diese bestimmt ist. Aber auch diese deutschen Juden sterben aus. Wo immer sie auch sind, versuchen sie sich schnellstens zu assimilieren, haben keine Zeit und kein Geld zurückzudenken. Dies gilt für Israel ebenso wie für Amerika. By her own account, Tergit felt that readers had rejected her book because she had represented German Jews as they were, namely, rooted in German culture. It was only in 1977 that Tergit finally met with renewed interest from a German-speaking audience, after a radio feature on her work had led to her being invited to a literary festival in Berlin. However, her work fell into near oblivion again after that, until Juliane Zucker and Nicole Henneberg started publishing on Tergit from the mid-2010s. This year appears to be a rare chance for Tergit's work to finally also find a larger Anglophone readership. In view of the book's upcoming first ever publication in English, I had the exciting opportunity to interview the translator Sophie de Vernooy about challenges that she encountered during the project. According to Sophie, one of the most significant difficulties was the fact that Effingers is structurally modeled on a 19th century family novel, yet stylistically constitutes an original blend of different modes of writing, as I outlined earlier. Since there was no clear English language equivalent for the mode of the original, Sophie turned to British women writers of the 20th century, such as Edith Wharton, Dorothy Sayers, Dawn Powell, and Elizabeth Taylor for inspiration. Additionally, the novel's frequent historical and culture-specific references, which often appear in passing, presented a problem. They had to be carefully researched, and Sophie decided to add footnotes to provide context for Anglophone readers. Specifically, translating Tergit's descriptions of fabrics, furniture, and decorative objects proved very difficult. Sophie spent considerable time browsing antique websites to find accurate equivalents in English. Another challenging aspect was the translation of political conversations. These sometimes appear wooden even in the original, as they are meant to represent different ideological positions in a somewhat schematic way. Sophie made some stylistic adjustments to improve readability in English. With this lecture, I hope to have whet your appetite for Tergit's work, whether in English or in German. Much remains to be discovered about this striking author, and in my dissertation, I hope to shed more light on another important yet little researched text from her oeuvre, which is her posthumous memoir from 1983. I thank you again for the opportunity to lecture here today and for your kind attention, and I'm excited for your questions and comments.